First, let's have a nice welcome for our journalistic legend. Juan Gonzalez. Juan, you have an award-winning muckraking column where you've taken on local governments, federal government, police department, mayors, corporations on behalf of environmental justice or workers' rights, racial justice. You co-host Democracy Now!, as probably most of the room knows. You write these meticulously documented books. You work for nonprofit. You've helped the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. You helped save Pacifica when it was nearly falling apart from internal strife. So my first question is, how do you do it all, and when do you sleep?
Well, it does get tough at times, especially doing the research on my book projects, because that's it really takes an inordinate amount of time when you're doing your own research as well as writing. But I think that I don't know. I've just managed to sort of utilize each of the different parts of the work that I do to inform the other. And I've been lucky in the 25 years I've been on staff at the New York Daily News that most of the time my editors have been flexible enough to allow me to take extra time sometimes when I'm on a reporting assignment, to just sort of take an extra week or two to do some additional work if I'm doing working on research for a book. Even though at the Daily News I'm often in contradiction, I don't know how many people know the New York Daily News, but it's a pretty conservative, a commercial newspaper, and I'm often at odds with my editors and owners, but I've never taken it personally. I see it as part of their cultural deprivation, that they don't understand things, and so I never. Even when I have conflicts with my editors, it's always on a respectful basis, and they in turn return it to me, even though when they think I'm crazy, my political views, just let me do what I want to do. So I think that I've been able to meld the different parts, so it's really all one effort. It's just a question of breaking it up into different mediums and different specific projects.
Do you ever get 8 hours sleep?
Yes, increasingly. I really work at it, it's really only a question of sort of managing your time and taking out the unnecessary stuff that you really don't need to do, and I have slowed down, I guess you want to say. My wife says I haven't, but I think I have slowed down over the last 10 or 15 years in terms of the amount of time spent. And I also have cut down, we were talking about this before, cut down dramatically on travel. I really try as little as possible to travel, because travel, the United States is a big country. It takes a lot of time to go from one part to another, or to be going to other parts of Latin America. So I've really significantly tried to cut down on travel over the last 10 years, and that's saved me a lot more time to devote to particular project.
Let's take the temperature of the room. How many people regularly listen to or watch Democracy Now!? How many regularly read the New York Daily News? You are missing out on this column. All right, so back to the New York Daily News. I moved to New York in '86, and a few years later there was a militant strike of the workers at the Daily News, including the journalists, led by the Newspaper Guild, and Juan was a leading Newspaper Guild activist. And I remember being at a strike rally. The group I was with, FAIR, was supporting the strikers, and I heard this impassioned speech from some guy named Juan Gonzalez. And I remember turning to my friend and saying, wow, that guy doesn't sound like your typical mainstream journalist. And as I've learned, he's never been your typical mainstream journalist. But it leads me to the question, which is, having looked at media from both sides, having worked at the Philadelphia Daily News, a mainstream daily, and then the New York Daily News for 25 years, and been on the other side with independent publishers and with Democracy Now! What is the from someone like you as a unique perspective, what's the importance of independent media? What gaps do they fill?
Well, I think there's a huge importance, not just now, but throughout American history of the dissident press in America. And in fact, one of the things I'll mention tonight is that there's a real long, proud tradition of the alternative or dissident non-commercial press in America, going back to the working men's press of the 1830s and the Muckrakers of the late 19th and early 20th century, the New Left press of the 1970s, and of course now the progressive bloggers and public and community broadcasting in the 1950s and early 60s, and now you've got all kinds of progressive alternative and mostly non-commercial media, whether it's Common Dreams or Truth Out or Democracy Now! Or Grit TV, and they're all part of a tradition of the press of opposition, the dissident press in America. But I've also been lucky to be involved in the third, because I call them the three great streams of American journalism, which is the corporate or commercial media, which is what most people regard as a media. There's the dissident and non-commercial media. But there's also another huge stream that has received even less attention, which is the what's commonly called as the press of the ethnic and racial minorities, the ethnic press. And I've had the opportunity to work on, when I was years back in the Young Lords, I was one of the early editors of our newspaper, which was called Palante back then, and then later on in the 80s, I helped to found a bilingual weekly newspaper in the Puerto Rican community of Philadelphia, Polk. So I've sort of had my feet in all three of the streams of the media in America, and part of my frustration and my attempts to write news for all the people is I was just continually frustrated how these three streams of the press in America operate, and not just independently, but for the most part almost oblivious to each other's existence. And this is especially true of the press of racial minorities and ethnic minorities in the country, which has a long, proud tradition going back hundreds of years. But is virtually unknown in terms of its contributions, its heroes, its impact on press coverage in America. So that's part of what I try to do with News for Older People, is bring the three streams together in one sort of comprehensive look at the media in America.
And I think it's unique. There's no book like it. This new book, News for All the People, you have a section in there, liberal academics talk about the Muckrakers at the beginning of the 20th century as almost the model for media, and you've got some pages in your book about the racism among the Muckrakers.
Yeah, that's definitely a racial blind spot with Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens, and Ray Stannard Baker of the Muckrakers was probably the best. He did some articles on and some exposés of the Jim Crow South, but for the most part, the Muckrakers really represented a middle-class reformer trend in America that was, to some degree, not really that pro-labor, but it's definitely had very little concerns in terms of what was going on with the African Americans and Native Americans and the Latinos in the country. And what I try to raise there is what I call the colored Muckrakers that never got very much attention. Ida B. Wells, the great African American editor whose newspaper, the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight, was burned down in Memphis, Tennessee, and became one of the great writers exposing lynching in America. Jose Marti, perhaps one of the greatest figures in Latin America, both as a writer, a poet, a journalist, but most people don't realize that Jose Marti spent 16 years living in the United States, writing for Latin American newspapers. Marti wrote articles about the Haymarket the Haymarkets protests. He covered the he covered lynchings in the South. He wrote about everything from the opening of the Statue of Liberty to the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge to the U.S. policies against the Native Americans. So he really was a muckraker of his own, but he was writing in Spanish and largely for Latin American newspapers, but here in the United States. So I try to bring out some of these heroes of the muckraking press in America that really have never gotten much their due in terms of what they did here in the United States, and try to bring out some of their stories as well.
Another temperature of the room question. How many have read Juan's book on Harvest of Empire about Latino immigration? How many have read the new book about racism and race in the media throughout history, News for All the People? Okay. A couple last questions on your new book on race in the media. I think first, until you immerse yourself in your book, you have this sense in the history of American media, U.S. media, of racial blind spots, racial hostility, ignoring racial violence. That's sort of the sentiment that one would have until reading your book. And then after reading your book, you realize that the mainstream commercial media wasn't just ignoring racial violence. They were constantly, throughout history, encouraging racial violence against virtually every community of color inside this country. And you've got an incident in Utica, New York, which is only a couple hours from here, where they were having an abolitionist meeting in 1835 or so, and virtually, anti-slavery meeting, virtually every leading daily in the area was urging mob violence against that meeting. So without giving away your public presentation that's coming shortly, are there a few words about that the media, mainstream media, weren't just ignoring racism or racial violence. They were a major part of it throughout history.
Not only helping to develop the racial narrative, but also instigating the violence, and in some cases, actually helping to plan it. I mean, the biggest example that of that was the Wilmington Troubles of 1898. Where in November of 1898, a couple of thousand armed whites marched into the town of Wilmington, and they proceed to burn down the local black newspaper, Alexander Manley's Wilmington Record. They then round up all of the elected black officials of Wilmington at gunpoint. I understand Wilmington was a majority black city, and it was one of the last cities to maintain some semblance of democratic rule after Reconstruction.
Small d democratic.
Small d democratic, right. After Reconstruction. And so the group, they rounded up the black elected officials, put them on a train, shipped them out of town. And they appointed a former Confederate colonel as the new mayor of Wilmington. They then proceeded to shoot up the black community, killing dozens of people, and hundreds of African Americans fled. It was the only successful armed coup in American history, right, within the local government in American history. They just overthrew the government. President McKinley didn't bother to call in any federal troops or National Guards. Nobody was ever arrested for any of the killings. But the amazing thing is, as I began to research the events, the entire thing was orchestrated and led by the local editor and publisher of the News and Observer, Josephus Daniels. Josephus Daniels talks about all of this in his own autobiography, because he was one of the most respected Southern editors of his time. And very prolific writer. His autobiography is 3 volumes. So he boasts not only of leading the organization of the coup, but of how he would meet at night in his newspaper offices with the other leaders of the white vigilante group that organized the coup, to plan the coverage of the newspaper, to stir up more and more animosity toward the local black officials and the black community. And when the coup was succeeded, there was a huge meeting of the townspeople where everyone praised Josephus Daniels and the Observer for its role in preparing the ground for the coup. Now, Josephus Daniels, you'd think, well, this is just some crazy, racist editor. But no, he was a major figure in the press in America in the late 19th century. He was a populist. He had editorials against the railroads and the Duke family in North Carolina. He was a confidant of William Jennings Bryan. He was a close friend and a strategist for Woodrow Wilson. When Woodrow Wilson gets elected president, Woodrow Wilson names Josephus Daniels Secretary of the Navy. Josephus Daniels was our Secretary of the Navy during World War I. As Secretary of the Navy, he mentored a young undersecretary, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so when Roosevelt becomes president, he names Josephus Daniels U.S. Ambassador to Mexico. So Josephus Daniels was a major political figure in American journalism. He was also a murderer, a racist, a guy who boasted of burning down the black newspaper in his own town, an editor who boasted of it. And all of this you can find if you go on the internet, just Google Wilmington Race Riot of 1898, and you'll find the entire report that was done a few years ago. The state of North Carolina established a race commission about 8 or 9 years ago to investigate what had happened in 1898. And the Wilmington Race Commission issued a report documenting not only the role of Josephus Daniels and the Observer, of the News and Observer, but all of the newspapers of North Carolina. And since then, most of them have issued public apologies to their communities for their role in that coup. Now, it's all great that we now have a full documented report and that all these newspapers have apologized, but it's 100 years after it happened, right? And no one was ever held accountable for that coup. But it was completely led, orchestrated, and instigated by the local press of that state. And we have lots of examples in the book of that. The Camp Grant massacre of 200 Apaches in Arizona, which was fomented by the local the Citizen, what later became the Tucson Citizen, and the Wassoon Weekly. The role of the Rocky Mountain News in Denver, in the Sand Creek massacre of about 100 Cheyenne that were slaughtered by soldiers. Again, the groundwork set by the local Rocky Mountain News that wanted to get rid of the Native Americans that were making it difficult to turn Colorado into a state. All of the various riots that occurred in the 1830s and the 1840s against the abolitionists and meetings of whites and blacks opposed to slavery, many of which ended up in race riots, again fomented by the newspapers. You could go all the way to 1962 in Mississippi and the attempts to desegregate the University of Mississippi and the role played by the radio stations in Mississippi, radio and television stations, several of which were sanctioned by the FCC for openly exhorting the people of Mississippi to turn out to oppose the federal marshals that were seeking to to help segregate the University of Mississippi, and there was a huge gun battle that occurred in Oxford, Mississippi, where dozens of federal marshals were wounded in the violence to prevent James Meredith from entering the University of Mississippi. So these were all examples of the role of the press, not just in misrepresenting, mischaracterizing, producing stereotypes, but of actually being prime instigators and proponents of racial violence.
Part of the lynch mob. But let's take it from these historic examples more up to the present. Since you've been in the mainstream media, what can you say about racism or racial hostility you've encountered from colleagues or management? I mean, I remember you were at the Daily News when the Ellis Coast, the African American, became the editor of the editorial page, and he said that he found that his predecessor had left a memo that dictated that there could only be one column per day by an African American. It was like a quota system. This was the 1980s and 1990s, so just wondering if you can talk about more modern day in mainstream media.
Well, yeah, it's the early period of integration of the newsrooms. Because one of the things that I think we don't realize is that there were battles in this country to integrate the public schools, to integrate housing, to get equal rights in voting, but the battle within the media for racial integration of the news media itself has been a huge, huge battle. And again, there's a long history to it. It goes back to the early 1800s and then the early 1900s. But really, the hostility that erupted once the walls started coming down, and it was largely a result of community pressure, because there were virtually no African Americans, Latino, Asian Americans in the media until the 1970s. There were isolated examples, and I go into many of those isolated examples in the book, but really the large numbers first started coming in the 1970s. It was largely a result of a major court decision that occurred in Mississippi, again, the WLBT case in Jackson, Mississippi, when the federal courts began to side with the right of citizens to challenge station licenses of radio and television stations if they were not serving the entire community. Because Jackson was a prime example. It was 40% African American, and there'd never been an African American employed or virtually never shown on television, but definitely never employed in the station, all the TV stations and the radio stations in Jackson. So that was what the WLBT case was about. So in 1969, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia finally rules against the FCC and orders the station license of WLBT to be taken away because they had not served the entire community of Jackson. That unleashed the floodgates for protests across the country. Between 1970 and 1972, I think there was something like 350 license challenges to the radio and television stations across America. As groups of African Americans and Latinos in every city, civil rights groups got together, they started picketing the local stations, they started challenging their licenses, they started demanding changes in content of the programming, they started demanding hiring of more people, and that was what led to the whole first generation of journalists of color who entered the newsrooms. That's how Geraldo Rivera got on TV. That's how Ed Bradley got on TV. That's how Connie Chung got on TV. That's how all that first generation of reporters entered the newsrooms as a result of this massive protest that developed in the early 1970s challenging station licenses. And so the reporters and editors that were in there, in my case, I've been working at the Philadelphia Daily News for about 9 years. And in 1987, the the New York Daily News was found guilty in federal court of racial discrimination. It was the first time a newspaper had ever been found guilty of racial discrimination. A group of black reporters led by Dave Hardy and Joan Shepard and some others took the paper to court and won like $3.2 million lawsuit. But before then, there had been racial discrimination lawsuits at the New York Times, at the Washington Post, at the Associated Press. But in each case, the companies settled with the reporters before there was actually a trial. And they, in essence, either dragged the reporters through court for so long that they got tired, or they bought some of them off, or they basically managed to avoid a real decision. So the New York Daily News case was the first case where there was an actual court decision. And it sent shockwaves throughout the entire industry. Because then all the other editors started thinking, hey, the publishers, if the New York Daily News lost, we could be next. So then they started hiring more reporters. Next thing I know, here I am in Philadelphia, and I get a call from the editor-in-chief in New York. This is like a few months after this lawsuit, after the Daily News lost a suit. And he says, listen, we'd like to talk to you about coming to write a column in New York. And, and I really wasn't interested in returning to New York at the time, but it was a direct result of the fact that the paper had lost that suit and had to agree to do all these extra hirings. So when I walked into the Daily News in December of 1987, there was nothing but total hostility to my being there from the other reporters. They were the other white reporters. They were, one, angry that the paper had lost the lawsuit, and two, that the paper was beginning to try to diversify its news staff. And they saw me as a completely an affirmative action hire, right? And so for months, it was like, it was very few people that would even talk to me in news. And this was true in newspapers and television stations across America. Those first reporters encountered nothing but complete hostility. As a result of that hostility, we all started to organize our own professional journalism groups because we needed support. So that's how you started having development of the National Association of Black Journalists, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, the Native American Press Association, and the Asian American Journalists, because we needed support groups to be able to survive in the newsrooms that were so hostile to us at the time. But then as more and more people got in, some of that hostility started to break down. And you mentioned the Daily News strike. That was really what ended the hostility for me, because that came in 1990. I'd been there. I was there about 3 years. And because I played a big role in the strike, and we won the strike, and after that, all the white reporters and editors were all like, now they were all friendly to me. Juan, you helped us with the strike and saved our jobs. And so then it got a little better. But until then, those first few years, it was really difficult.
One of the great things in the book is it shows that every time there's been an official challenge of racism and the racial narratives, racially discriminatory narratives in the mainstream media, it always came from these independent movements on the outside making demands, and the ethnic newspapers and independent press making demands. So in your book, we see how reluctant, like, Associated Press was to give up using the N-word.
Right.
And that had to come from the outside. How reluctant NBC was in giving up Amos and Andy. It was a huge campaign mounted by African-American weeklies.
Right.
And then you bring it up to current by talking about how independent groups are using the internet, like the campaign called Basta Dobbs, targeting the racist, Lou Dobbs, the immigrant basher on CNN. Talk a little bit about that, how important independent media and ethnic media have been in challenging the official racial narratives.
Oh yeah, no, it's been historic, and it's been, again, and very little is new. When you go into history, you find that people have tried to do similar things in the past. And so the Amos and Andy campaign, which was led by a great, perhaps the greatest African-American journalist of the 20th century, Robert L. Vann, editor and publisher of the Pittsburgh Courier. You got to understand, Amos and Andy in the 1930s was bigger than anything you can imagine on TV today. It was the most popular show on radio, but it was a blackface minstrel program that was constantly demeaning to African Americans. And Robert L. Vann, in 1932, is so furious at this show that he begins a campaign across the country to encourage African Americans and others to write to the Federal Radio Commission to protest this show. He inspired 700,000 letters to the Federal Radio Commission. It was about 1 of every 10 African Americans in the country at the time, wrote to the government to complain about Amos and Andy. It was a huge attempt of the black community to get the government to hear their complaints, and he did it against the opposition of other black newspapers. The Amsterdam News and the Chicago Defender, all were because the Amos and Andy characters, who were the highest paid entertainers of their time, Godsden and Carell, they lived in Chicago, and they were sort of friendly to the editor of the other great black newspaper, the Chicago Defender. And so the Defender would not criticize Amos and Andy, neither would the Amsterdam News. So Vann not only had to go against the dominant NBC network, he had to go against other black editors and publishers within his own community. It was really a class struggle in terms of perspective. But there's no doubt that he won the day because he was able to mobilize his enormous opposition. Of course, the Federal Radio Commission never did anything, never even responded to the complaints. And of course, when Amos and Andy went on television in the 50s, they then hired African Americans to do the parts rather than the white characters who were the ones that were doing it on radio. But yeah, that was an extremely important battle. But there were many others. It's the work that was done by the Asian press. I quote, for instance, Ning Pung Chu, who was the editor of China West, which was the second Chinese language daily in the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s in San Francisco. That was when obviously the Hearst newspaper in San Francisco was the dominant paper. And Ning would, I forget the exact quote now, I have it in the book, but he says, in San Francisco, we have the phenomena that the yellow man puts out the white paper and the white man puts out the yellow paper, referring to Hearst and yellow journalism. And he said, we try to write the facts and be objective. And when San Francisco had its horrific earthquake in 1906, the city fathers and the press wanted to use the earthquake as an excuse to move all the Chinese out of downtown San Francisco and rebuild the area. And so Ning began a huge campaign in his newspaper informing the Chinese of their rights in the United States to stay in their homes. And he was successful in winning that battle. And those of you who've been to San Francisco and Chinatown in San Francisco, you realize that you will now realize that if it had not been for that Chinese newspaper editor in 1906 mobilizing the Chinese community to defend its community and resist the efforts to get them out, there would be no Chinatown in San Francisco. So these are the examples of these editors who really affected policy and who really raised media reform long before most of us have heard about media reform.
Okay, I'm going to open it up. The questions can be about things beyond the latest book, News for All.
I'm a language teacher, and I can read some of the papers that I see on newsstands in New York. But I wonder who owns them, and do they work together? Does the Polish newspaper ever talk to the Puerto Rican newspaper or the Chinese newspaper and have joint projects?
Well, increasingly there is more cooperation and interchange. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the New America group in California, and there was the Independent Press Association in New York, which tries to bring together the various ethnic presses, as well as radio and TV, and they hold training sessions and they exchanges of information. So that's been, because there is a real explosion still in foreign language and ethnic press in America. So there is much more cross-fertilization in recent years as a result of these associations that have developed, because most of the presses in the early years stayed pretty much self-contained. Like, for instance, the first Latino press group in the United States was developed actually in New Mexico in 1892. And there were a couple of efforts of African Americans to form press groups around the same time. You had the Alabama Colored Press Association in around the 1880s, and then T. Thomas Fortune, the editor of the Age, the black newspaper in New York, formed a press association in the 1890s. But these stayed pretty much within their own group. Increasingly now you're getting these alliances or groups of the ethnic press. As to the question of who owns them, that's an interesting problem because increasingly, especially the Spanish language press, which is huge in America today, obviously, it's increasingly non-Hispanic owned. And so what you have is you have major media companies, either foreign owned or American media companies, exploiting the market. They see a market for advertising rather than a need for information to be filled. So for instance, the Telemundo network is owned now by NBC. Univision, the giant of Spanish language television, is largely owned by American hedge funds. They get most of their programming, though, from the two media giants of Latin America, which are Televisa, which is the big Mexican media conglomerate, and Venevisión, which is the big Venezuelan media conglomerate. So most of their programming actually is not U.S. programming. It's, I mean, those of you, I don't know how many of you ever happened to pass Univision and see the novelas, the soap operas, the Spanish language soap operas. They're all based in Mexico, and with a Mexican reality and not a U.S. reality. So there are very few independently Latino-owned media outlets in the United States. Even the two big newspapers, which are L'Opinión in Los Angeles and El Diario La Prensa in New York, are now owned. Well, they were owned for a while by a group that was owned by U.S. hedge funds and run by a Canadian patent, but they just recently sold to they're controlled now to a right-wing Venezuelan media group, newspaper group. So you basically have either foreign ownership or media ownership from Anglos in the United States. There's virtually no Latino-owned media in the United States today.
What about in local, like Chicago and Pittsburgh? There's small local...
Well, no, when I say media, I'm talking about major, either dailies or radio and television. There are still many weeklies that are independently owned in many towns, and they are growing in number. The problem is, once you get to a certain level, then the media companies want to buy it. Once you become successful as a small independent weekly, then the big media companies want to buy you up. And I believe that ownership is critical. It's a critical issue. It's, having worked in the media for all these years, I understand that the owners don't dictate day-to-day policy, but the people they hire do things in their image. And on the big issues, who we're going to support for the presidential election, what are we going to do if there's a war coming up, then the owners step in and they call the shots. And so therefore, unless you have a diversified ownership of the media in America, you're never going to have diversified points of view, independent points of view.
There's, I want to just say one thing. There's an important website you may not know of called voicesofny.com. Yeah, which is the best of the ethnic and community press, is their subtitle. And they not only, and it is an effort to get independently owned ethnic and community newspapers out. And they translate from Chinese, they translate from Polish, they translate from other languages. It's an utterly amazing website. That's an effort to unite various independent ethnic media. We're going to, a question here and then in the back. Yes?
Yes, hi. I would like to know your comments about journalists on like Fox News and Rush Limbaugh. Do you have anything like that? You talked about that in your book?
Yes, I mean...
Okay, the question was, what are his observations or comments about the journalists, I think you wanted that in quotes, the journalists at Fox News and the Rush Limbaughs?
Of this word.
Yeah, I mean, we deal to some extent in the book on them. I think that, you know, they are sort of, I was discussing with some folks earlier, you know, this whole trend of, it started with Limbaugh and talk radio in the 1980s. After the, you know, the Federal Communications Commission used to have what they called a fairness doctrine. That if you were going to make strong statements about one issue or another, you had to provide an opportunity for different voices to be heard. So after Ronald Reagan became president and his FCC chairman, Mark Fowler, began to roll back all of the gains that were made in the 1970s, and one of the things they did is they eliminated the fairness doctrine. As soon as that happened, you had the explosion of right-wing radio, talk radio, because a station was no longer limited by having to air opposing views. And so that's how Limbaugh and all these others began developing on talk radio. Then what happened was, when cable expanded to the point where now there were all of these, and increasingly now you have all, because talk TV is cheap. You don't have to spend time getting reporters and sending them out and doing reports. You can just have somebody pontificate and bring in some guests who you don't pay to guess anything because they'd love to be on TV and get their name spread. So it's cheap TV, and especially if you have an all-news channel, it's an easy way to fool the people. And you're not getting all news, you're getting all opinion. So talk radio morphed into talk TV. And so that's how I think Fox and has built this following. And you know, and while, and I have to say, I mean, I'm critical of Fox. I'm also critical of MSNBC. MSNBC is the Democratic Party version of Fox News. It's increasingly become the Democratic Party version of Fox News. So I think that it really is not news as much as it is a forum for opinions. But the reason the networks do it is because it's cheap. And are the people journalists? Well, you know, so many of them are former politicians and I mean, Al Sharpton is I know Al Sharpton well, but having covered Al for many years, now having to see him as a journalist or at least somebody with a press pass, is a strange situation that's occurring in America. But it's the same thing with O'Donnell, who used to be a big guy for Pat Moynihan. He was basically a political operative, so many of them are politicians now who have a show, Well, I have nothing against politicians having shows. There should be some distinction between journalists and folks who are just temporarily employed doing this kind of program.
After the fairness doctrine was abolished, in the 1990s, FAIR.org started surveying a lot of these talk radio stations, and we found that on a lot of stations, Limbaugh was actually a liberal voice compared to the others. You know Randy Credico, the comic?
Yeah.
Yeah. Randy Credico used to define the spectrum in American media in that era. He said it's right, righter, fascist, Third Reich. All right, Pablo.
Hi, Juan. This comes from personal experience, so I don't know, like about 13 years ago when I first came to the States as a younger, very optimistic journalist, some of my professors used to say, they said that like the Latino population was growing and that was the next gold mine, and it was going to be a big market, and people who wrote in Spanish and in English would have an edge, and Spanish media would develop everywhere. And I was surprised by two things over the course of the years. One is that since the day I arrived in New York until today, the Spanish media seems to be so poor, and like the quality has not improved. And if you compare media in English versus media in Spanish, the difference is staggering. The quality of the reporting, the quality of the writing, etc. I can't come to terms with the fact that it's so poorly written. And we have really good writers and very good reporters. So that's one of the questions. Why do you think that there's such big difference? And the second one, if it was the big market and the Spanish population keeps on growing, etc., why, like newspapers like the New York Daily News, for instance, close Viva New York and Hora Hispana, and how can that be explained? I'm not blaming you or anybody, but like I don't understand it, and maybe you can.
The owner of the Daily News takes his orders from Juan.
On the quality issue, yes, there's no doubt that there's in the corporate commercial media, there's a huge decline in the quality of the product across the board. I wouldn't even say decline. I would say at this stage it's plummeting in terms of the quality of the news produced in America. Largely because, one, the economic model that has sustained commercial journalism in America for 200 years is falling apart. The media in America were an advertiser-driven system. The theory that advertisers would pay and the owners could pay for reporters off of the income they made from advertising. The internet, and I'm going to get into this tonight, how technology continues to subvert the existing order. But the internet has subverted the existing model of advertising-driven journalism. And so whether it's in the English language or the Spanish language, legacy, what we call legacy media, radio, TV, and print, they no longer are willing to expend the money to provide quality reporting. So everyone wants to produce stuff for the cheapest price possible. So I think that's a huge problem. The other one is in terms of the Spanish language press in particular. The goal of the Spanish, of these media companies, like the Daily News or the Los Angeles Times, or now you're getting it more in the TV with Fox, the Fox Latino, and they all want, all the big networks want to start their Latino reporting divisions now. The aim is not to inform, it's to exploit. It's to exploit the market, not to inform the public. And so they're constantly looking for the cheapest way to do it. For instance, all the Spanish language press that was open, the Daily News, they didn't go the route of some of these other Western papers, which they began to actually contract out their content to Mexico, right? They were doing maquila-like operations where they would have all of the content in their paper in San Jose, or the San Jose Mercury did this for a while, the Scripps papers did it for a while, and a bunch of their papers, where they would actually do a Spanish language insert that was produced by reporters working in Mexico, and then they would just stick it into their local newspaper, thinking that somehow they could get advertising and reader interest in that. So what's happened is every time, and I've seen the daily, I've stayed away completely from the Daily News efforts to do Spanish language media because I knew that they weren't serious about it from the start. And I knew that every single model they've tried over the years, the Viva magazine was an excellent, the only good product. Because all the other ones, they always wanted to have fluff, entertainment. They wanted to stay away from controversial subjects, controversial matter, because they were just interested in attracting advertisers. So I think that you have in general with the media in America, the advertising-driven model is falling apart. No one knows what's going to replace it with the internet, because the internet's not generating the revenues necessary to sustain a living wage for a sufficient number of reporters. You know, the internet right now is being produced in large part by young people getting paid substandard wages with no benefits, no pensions, no benefits to speak from, no health insurance. And at a certain time, those young people are going to need to get married, get a house, and they're going to need a job that pays sufficiently for them to do that. So I think that the problem is the new financial model is not there to sustain commercial journalism. Community journalism right now, alternative journalism is still surviving as it always has on very low budgets, but the commercial journalism situation right now is really dire.
But until the minute like Viva was canceled, it had advertising. I mean, there were ads in the pullout. There were ads when it appeared on first. It seemed to. I mean, I don't know, but like it doesn't seem like it was like a financial reason. They took it down for financial reasons, and I don't know. Maybe I'm speculating.
Yeah, I think that what they're doing is they're continuing to cut staff. They continue to cut staff, and even if you are making some money, they're looking short-sightedly about, in the next quarter, how much are we going to save by axing these 3 or 4 people? And they live under the illusion that they can continue to collect that advertising revenue now with part-time people, and even producing less original content and more recycled content. So yeah, it's a downward spiral right now in the commercial media that doesn't promise to be letting up anytime soon.
Yes.
Changed, or maybe your focus in terms of what you see as the problems that the Latino community to face, or maybe you see it now as a class, or I don't know. And also, what would you tell the students in terms of their frustrations, in terms of what should we do next? Obviously, we're not like saying, hey, lead us, Juan, but in terms of your own sense of analysis, ideology, and struggle.
And for those that aren't familiar, explain in short what the Young Lords were.
Oh, me or him?
You were in it. He wasn't born yet.
Well, I mean, the Young Lords were sort of a revolutionary political group that developed in the late 1960s and early 1970s to sort of defend and attempt to get some sort of equal treatment for the Puerto Rican community of Chicago, New York, and a bunch of other cities up and down the East Coast, Boston, Bridgeport, Philadelphia, Newark, and Detroit. We also had a chapter there, and I think that the lessons I learned then, we were all very young then. We were probably younger than a lot of you. I think I was one of the oldest people in the leadership, and I was like 20 years old. We had people on leadership who were 16 years old, so it was the most important lesson is that young people can change the world, and that young people have an enormous capacity to have an impact on society, and that when they can pull together, when they can get a sense of a vision of what kind of life and what kind of society they want, that they have enormous power, much more than anybody will give you credit for. And I think the other big important aspect of what the Lord's, what we taught ourselves, because that's what we did to ourselves, was that, because the United States is changing dramatically, and so are all of the advanced industrial countries in the world today. The same kind of debate we're having here about immigration, they're having it in France, they're having it in England, they're having it in Germany, they're having it in Italy, having it in all these countries. Because the great phenomena that has occurred over the last 50, 60 years is that the people of the former colonial countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America are coming to the West. And it's the other side of globalization. They always talk about the free flow of capital and breaking down barriers to trade and all this other stuff. But the other side of the free flow of capital is the flow of labor. What has happened is labor in the world has become more mobile. And so you're having these huge migrations of people across borders. And for the most part, the people of the third world are going to the metropolis of their former colonial masters. The reason why there are so many Algerians and Tunisians and Moroccans in France is because those were the former colonies of France. The reason why there are so many Indians and Pakistanis and Jamaicans in England is because those were the former colonies of England. The reason there's so many Turks in Germany is because Germany used to dominate Turkey and the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. The old Muslim Empire. And in the United States, the reason there are so many Latin Americans and Caribbeans is because that was the original birthplace of the American Empire, where all the great multinational corporations first developed and then expanded around the world. So what's increasingly happening is that the third world is coming to the West, and that they're transforming the very characters of these nations. The other part of it is that the nations need them. Because all the countries that fought in World War II and now have this huge baby boomer generation have the problem that they have a huge portion of their population about to retire and not enough young workers to maintain all of these people that are heading into retirement age. Italy is right now in population decline, but in all of France, England, Russia, they're all facing the same problems. They don't have enough young workers. So the United States as well. So that even despite all this anti-immigrant fervor of the last 20 years, it doesn't jive with the historical trends, which is the United States will need more young workers for decades to come. And most of those workers are going to come from Latin America and the Caribbean, increasingly from Asia and Africa. So the country's going to continue to change. So therefore, you as a young person, you're at the cusp of a huge transformation of American society. And you are more valuable now than you've ever been, and Latinos have ever been. But there has to be greater understanding between all the different groups in American society, that America is not about particular ethnicity or culture. It's about ideals and principles and the founding of the country. And I think that, if I were 20 years old or 21 years old right now, I'd be very optimistic about the future because I think you have an enormous opportunity to have an impact on the new America that is coming into being. And I think that that this anti-immigrant fervor will pass. It's going to do a lot of damage. It already has done a huge amount of damage, but it will pass. And I think that it's already beginning to pass. I mean, the seminal moment for the Latino community in America was March to May of 2006. I think when the histories are written 20 years from now, March to May of 2006 will be seen as what the 1963 Civil Rights March was in Washington, what the anti-war protests in Kent State and the anti-war protests were in the 1970s. It was the defining moment for the Latino community in the United States. Because in a few months period, millions, not hundreds, not thousands, millions of people poured out into the streets of the United States in the largest series of protests in the history of the country. And it wasn't just in Washington or in San Francisco. It was 50,000 people in Denver, 45, 50,000 people in Phoenix, 500,000 people in Los Angeles. Dallas, 200,000. Dallas had never seen anything like 200,000 people marching in the streets around any issue before. Nashville, Tennessee, 20,000 people turned out in Nashville, Tennessee. In all these little towns across America, all of these Latino kitchen workers and factory workers and nannies and with all their children and their church leaders, their pastors, and all marched in the streets saying, you cannot treat us this way. And I think it was all the young people that participated in those protests are the new political leaders of the future in America. Because those protests changed their lives. And the dreamers are all products of those protests. And everything else that is coming in the future, well, when you look back at it, you can trace it back to what happened from March to May of 2006.
Juan, let's show the trailer from the new movie.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it might help because a lot of people. For those of you who have not read the book, Harvest of Empire, it's been revised, The History of Latinos in America, and there's a new documentary based on Juan's book, and I want to just play, it'll be helpful, and it connects to your original question about the Rush Limbaughs and the right-wingers who dominate so much of talk TV and talk radio. Maybe we should move it. Okay.
Start out. change.
You weren't in the game, you were All right, should we take a, oh, there we go. Ready to go? Okay, people.
Once again, the streets of our country were taken over today by people who don't belong here.
When the immigrants come, they come with a culture of criminality. It's out of control. They put a strain on our social security, our education, our health care.
They never teach us in school that the huge Latino presence here is a direct result of our own government's actions in Mexico, the Caribbean, and Central America over many decades. Thousands upon thousands of Puerto Ricans were actually recruited to come work here in the United States.
The feeling was we could very easily overthrow this progressive government and make it a lot easier for the United Fruit Company and other American businesses to operate in Central America.
From the very beginning, the West depended for its labor on Mexicans.
Are you a communist, Well, wait for the history. The history will say what we are.
I had never seen anything like El Salvador. I was more frightened there than Vietnam. What was going on there was the slaughter of the innocents.
When you finance and train a gang of uniformed butchers and they begin wholesale killing, the people don't emigrate. They flee.
The instability that we have contributed to creates the kind of chaos and disarray that leads to more immigration.
I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots even though they may have entered illegally.
The reality is that America is changing. By the end of this century, a majority of the people will trace their origins not to Europe, but to Latin America.
We're all humans, we all have the same abilities, we all have the same potential.
America has always been a nation in the process of becoming, in process of change. It is an immigrant nation.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple more questions. I wanted to make a quick announcement. For those of you who are justice-oriented students, especially communication students, who might want to intern at an independent media outlet, you should see me in the coming weeks. If you watched the Oscars last night, and probably there's no one in the room that knows this, except Maura and Brandy, who I told, one of those guys who won, was able to pass out the Oscars to the presenters who handed them out to the winners, who had won the first Oscar student. He was one of our independent media internships 3 summers ago. That's Tatenda Mbudzi from Zimbabwe. So these independent media internships might be important to you if you're inclined in that direction. Who's got a question? Students.
Students.
Yes.
I was wondering, you said when you first were working in New York and there was a really hostile environment, did you have trouble finding sources for your pieces? And how do you find sources for your pieces now?
I didn't hear the first part of it.
When you were first working in New York and you said it was a really hostile environment, did you have trouble finding sources for your pieces? And if you have trouble finding sources now, and how you go about that for your pieces that are on hand?
No, I've never had problems finding or getting sources of people to write about. Mostly because, again, I was very active in New York when I was in the Young Lords, so I was pretty well known in the Latino community before we came back to the city, and also because I do something very unusual, which is I answer the phone. And at a newspaper, when you answer the phone, people call up many times with a lot of crazy people call up, a lot of angry people call up, but they call up with often with very good tips or very good stories, so I've never had a problem finding stuff to write about. Even in the face of that hostility, because all that happens when you have a hostile situation in a newsroom is that the editors don't throw you stories. They don't, in other words, in any newsroom they develop favorites, and then the favorites always get the best dibs on the good stories. Since I was never a favorite, it was never a big deal. But so I sort of cultivated early on in my career, developing my own sources in the community and in the labor movement, and because of that, I've usually been able to get stories myself without having to rely on my editors to assign me, so I've never had
And now
a
that
problem
you've
with that.
now that you've broken so many stories, you won awards, you've exposed scandals, am I right that stories come to you far more easily?
Oh, yeah,
now?
much more easily. Especially if you develop a reputation of someone who's not going to burn their source or get somebody fired, or and that you can be trusted. Word of mouth spreads. In Spanish we call it radio bemba. And the word of mouth spreads, and then more people. I'm often called up. I say, "Oh, a friend of mine who did a story with you 5 years ago or 10 years ago said I should call you." That kind of stuff, because the word of mouth spreads, and then people. And if you're there long enough, I mean, I've been there 25 years now. So after a while, people see you often enough, and they like your stories often enough. They believe you're the only person that will give them a fair hearing, and that's something to be said for institutional memory, or staying in one place for a while.
Okay, any other student questions? Yes, you two, one at a time. Maybe go right after each other, and then he'll answer both.
Okay. So my question is, in every journalism class that we've taken, we've talked about the changing medium of media and how it used to be very print-based, and now it's moving much more online, especially independent media, which is what we're talking about in our independent media postal chapter. What I'm wondering is, what do you see as like the biggest challenges for ethnic media and dissident media, kind of in this progression from kind of print to online now?
And then maybe one more question, and then he'll answer them both.
Actually, this goes really well with Jamie's question. How can we as consumers put pressure on mainstream media to have more intellectual discussions about immigration policy and different things, so we just don't have stupid people saying stupid things and not
You could have a picket sign, "Stop stupid people saying stupid things."
All right. Well, on the first one, I think, and I'm sorry, maybe it's by creeping age here. Forgetting the gist of your first question.
It was, as we move to the internet,
Yeah.
what problems does that create for independent or ethnic media?
Well, I don't think the problems are very much different from the commercial media, which are grappling with the same things, except you have less resources to deal with them. I think that, I'm of the mind that the medium doesn't really matter for good journalism. Whether you're in print, radio, TV, film, you're doing the same thing. You're telling stories, and you're hopefully telling stories that not only illuminate the individual human condition, but broaden it out to the deeper meanings or trends that are involved in that particular story that you're talking about. So I think that the job of a journalist, independently of how they get the story out, is the real job is getting the story, is digging up the good stories, being able to thoroughly report them. This whole thing of like, the one danger of the internet is the time thing, because it used to be that in a newspaper you had a day to get a story out, and you had a couple of editions, 3 or 4 editions, to update it. And then TV, the same thing. It used to be that you had to get it in for the evening news, at least you had part of the day. But now, with the internet, this obsession with being the first to report something, regardless of whether it's accurate or not, or whether you fully analyzed it or reported, is really driving, it's creating this rush to the bottom in terms of like, it's not who gets the story first, it's who gets the story right and who gets it best. And I think that, so that's why I try to stay away from our editors who constantly want to get web stories up as quickly as possible. Because it's guaranteed to produce not only errors, but huge libel suits everywhere. So I think that the key thing is to get the story well and get it comprehensively, and then how you get it out, whether it's in print, because I mean even on the internet somebody still has to write it. So has to write. There's some English that's a file somewhere.
Computers don't write them now.
And I think so whether it's the editing for radio or TV, the mechanics is separate from having a good story, and I think that's the critical issue.
And then the other one was, how do we stop stupid people from seeing stupid things in the media?
I don't know.
You can join fair.org, which is an organized effort to challenge media bias.
Yeah, because unfortunately America has cultivated the industry of stupid people saying stupid things, and so it's a hard trend to buck. But I think that's the importance of independent media. As we always say, Democracy Now! Democracy Now! Is one of the few shows left, and most community radio still is, where people actually get to talk in full sentences. I always tell journalism students, watch your 6 o'clock news, and I challenge you to find anybody who's interviewed on 6 o'clock news who utters a complete sentence. They are edited to the point where only phrases of 3 or 4 words are an interview. So that there is really no sense of reasoned thinking or introspection or analysis in any of the stuff that's produced on so many of these shows. On Democracy Now! We ask a person a question, they can go on and talk for 5, 10 minutes, and and then we'll throw in another question.
Yeah, or in the case of Chomsky, 25 minutes.
Amy and I have some differences on that.
When we used to interview Noam on Counterspin, Fair's radio show, we wouldn't make a list of questions. The debate among the staff would be, okay, what's our question? Okay, one final student, yes.
Okay, I have 2 questions, but I think this one will be more interesting. But
can you stand up and speak so we can all hear you?
Sure.
Louder,
So you talked about revenue streams, and especially with the transition of most media going online. And I actually read something the other day that was talking about how the traditional model of cost per views is actually transferring and transcending online, and how media outlets online are actually, because it is so quantifiable, and because you know exactly who is reading and who is seeing everything online, that you can really, the advertising revenue stream is much more exact. And so my question is how we all know that marketers more and more want to effectively reach their target. And with, just for instance, in Georgia, the Hispanic population constitutes $17 billion of spending power every year. It is in the marketer's natural best interest to target these ethnic community websites, and especially the media outlets. So where does the ethical line of giving this very rare, or not rare, but very precious, this is exactly who you're looking for in a target market, and this is your media, and you need money to pay your journalists and the people that are working for the website, but do you want to go into that? So I don't know exactly how to phrase that question best, but where do the ethics
where do the ethics translate in terms of you're utilizing the measurement of the audience or the eyeball measurement systems to decide what you're going to write about?
I mean, well, it's. I feel like there's such a question of, like, you have this media outlet and you need the money to make this, and the traditional media works on a lot of advertisement streams, and it's just, to me, I was wondering what your thoughts on that were.
Well, let me.
And how do you develop stories or content in an ethical way when you know you've got all these quantifiers that tell you exactly who your people are and what they want?
Well, and also there's a bigger problem that journalists sometimes report stories that people don't want to hear, right? Or that people don't immediately think are important. And what do you do then? Because I worked on a story for a couple of years. I mean, since I'm a columnist, I'm always writing one or another thing. But for about a couple of years, I've been spending a lot of time delving into government expenditures on computer information systems, because most of us don't realize the enormous amount of money that governments are spending to supposedly create databases and modernize their work and reduce labor forces by bringing in huge technology companies to revamp their computer systems and information systems. I'm talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. So I sort of and it's a new form of urban political patronage. It used to be construction, now it's computer contracts, right? IT contracts. So I began investigating a timekeeping system that the city of New York was developing. The city of New York has 300,000 workers, right? Government workers. And they needed, in the old days people would punch time clocks. How do you know when a worker in the parks department or this or that comes into work on time and track their hours and pay them? So they needed to develop a timekeeping payroll system, a new one. And I began looking into this and found this huge amounts of money being spent on this payroll system. And when I first started reporting it, my editors, they were not interested at all. Well, and if I had been a regular reporter, they never would have run the story. But since I'm a columnist and I have a space reserved for me a couple times a week, they had to run it, even though they didn't pay much attention to it. Well, I kept digging at it. It became a huge scandal called the City Time scandal. And eventually the federal government got involved, and they arrested 11 people, and the U.S. attorney called it the most massive fraud in the history of New York City. By the time they got into it, the city had spent $700 million on a system that started out at $60 million. And it spent $700 million, and most of it had been ripped off. Last year, the SAIC, the defense contractor that was indicted, as well as all the different consultants, paid the city of New York back $500 million in one check for the fraud that they had perpetrated on this one computer system. Yes, 11 people were indicted, 2 have pled out, 1 died, and the other 8 are waiting for trial. But the thing is that $500 million was paid back. Now, Mayor Bloomberg never thanked me for the comment, and even though he got the money. But if the metric system had been imposed on this, I never would have gotten that thing in the paper. But I kept saying there's something wrong here. I got to keep digging and keep digging. So I think my point is audience measurements are great for advertisers, are lousy for reporters. Reporters should not be worried about audience measurement. They should be worried about what's a good story, what's an important story, and what's a story that needs to be told.
We're going to regather in less than an hour in Emerson. I hope you're all there. Let's thank Juan Gonzalez.
Tonight we all watched the Oscars. In about 5 or 6, well, many of us watched the Oscars. In about About 5 or 6 weeks, date not chosen yet. I want to see all of you here when the Park Center for Independent Media gives out that more important award, the Izzy Award, for Outstanding Achievement in Independent Media. The winner has not been chosen yet. That's the award named after I.F. Izzy Stone. Past winners have included our speaker's colleagues at Democracy Now!, people like Amy Goodman, people like Jeremy Scahill, Sharif Abdel-Qaddous have all won the award. I want to make a couple quick announcements and then get right to our speaker. First, an off-campus announcement. Move to Amend is having a teach-in this Sunday on the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United and related issues. Corporations are not people. Money is not speech. That teach-in is Sunday, this Sunday, 2 to 5 at the Unitarian Annex on Buffalo Street near Aurora Street. An announcement that's on campus for you socially justice-oriented, human rights-oriented students, especially communication students. If you're looking for an internship at an independent media outlet this summer, please go to our website and check out the internship page. The website is simply ithaca.edu/indy, I-N-D-Y. Juan Gonzalez has a list of achievements too long to enumerate, besides being a native son of Brooklyn and East Harlem. As a student at Columbia University, he helped lead anti-Vietnam War protests and the 1968 student strike. He was the Minister of Education, the first Minister of Education for the Young Lords, an activist group of young Puerto Ricans who were modeled in part after the Black Panther Party. For 25 years, he's written an exceptional, not very mainstream column for the mainstream New York Daily News, where he's exposed police misconduct, the cover-up of toxic pollution from the World Trade Center collapse, wrongful evictions, wrongful deaths in the emergency room, a multi-million-dollar ripoff of New York City taxpayers, and for that last expose, which was detailed in column after column leading to federal indictments, he was given in 2011 the George Polk Award, his second George Polk Award. When he arrived at the New York Daily News, the photo file in the newspaper's library still listed Juan as, quote, Puerto Rican revolutionary. And someone crossed it out and penned in Daily News columnist. But from what I know of Juan, he's not ashamed of the revolutionary label to this day. After 25 years at the Daily News, that newspaper called Juan, quote, a beacon to whistleblowers and to wronged people for whom justice was lacking, unquote. He's the former president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. Most of you know him as the co-host of Democracy Now!, but you may not know the crucial diplomatic, firm role he played about a dozen years ago in saving Democracy Now! And saving Pacifica Radio when it was on the verge of collapse because of internal faction fighting. 2 weeks ago, we had a wonderful screening of the new documentary, Harvest of Empire, which is based on Juan's landmark history of Latino immigration into the United States. He's here to speak about his powerful new book, co-authored with Joseph Torres, titled News for All the People, The Epic Story of Race in American Media, and he will be signing both books right out here as soon as the question and answer session is over. So now, a warm Ithaca welcome for Juan Gonzalez.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you and good evening to all of you, and to
the Park Center for Independent Media and the School of Communications, my thanks for inviting me to spend a couple of days here with you at Ithaca. I usually give off-the-cuff presentations, but the older you get, sometimes the more disjointed your presentations become. So I actually prepared a few remarks, and I also brought along a slideshow that I use from time to time when talking about news for older people. One of my young daughters helped me prepare it because I'm not very savvy at PowerPoint presentations and needed some help from her. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the book, and I think I afterwards answer some questions. I understand this is a hotbed for Democracy Now! There's something like 5 different radio stations that carry Democracy Now! And which is wonderful in terms of the support that it provides, not only for our show, but for independent community media around the country. I've always considered myself more of a professional journalist than a historian, having devoted nearly 35 years now to chronicling day-to-day events in the areas of urban politics, economics, crime, law enforcement, labor, and race relations. What in my profession we typically refer to as hard news. I'm such a hard news junkie that I rarely pay much attention to the world of entertainment media, except to occasionally reflect on how it has shaped or at times distorted national consciousness, national identity, and the broader culture. But throughout my career, I've been acutely aware of the extraordinary role news media play in creating the memory bank of any nation. Newspapers, after all, have often been called the first draft of history. The incidents the media choose to report, their interpretation of events, inevitably serve as raw material that is then mined by scholars who come decades or centuries later to chisel more comprehensive historical accounts. When I attended public schools in New York City during the 1950s and early 1960s, the history books were far different than they are today. Back then, the only things worth recording, it seemed, when it came to heroic figures, politics, science, literature, art, and industry, was what had happened in Europe or among the descendants of those European settlers who ventured out to settle or colonize enclaves in the Western Hemisphere, Africa, and Asia. The overwhelming majority of our planet, the non-white peoples, were still regarded as shrouded in darkness or at least some inferior form of cultural development. As someone born in Puerto Rico, but raised all my life in the United States, I learned virtually nothing in school about my own homeland, a U.S. territory, and perhaps the most valuable overseas possession the United States has ever held. And so it was for so many Mexican, Cuban, Dominican, Salvadoran, Guatemalan, Honduran, Colombian, Panamanian children who, like myself, grew up here in the United States. Likewise for millions of African Americans and Native Americans and Asian American children. The stirring immigrant saga of settlers conquering the West to create the world's greatest democratic experiment somehow excluded those of us who had not come from Europe. Most importantly, the news media we grew up with kept depicting us as threats to society rather than contributors. West Side Story, one of the great Broadway musicals and films in the nation's history, ingrained in millions of Americans the stereotype of a Puerto Rican as a gang member with a knife and slick black hair, just as Birth of a Nation, decades before, had shaped images of black Americans as lusting after white women and prone to crime. The invariable lurid stories of black and Latino criminals produced by my own colleagues, many exaggerated, some vastly distorted, infuriated me. I knew from the experiences and stories of my own family and other hardworking Latinos that the news and entertainment media accounts, the history books, were incomplete, one-sided, and out of context. So I made up my mind many years ago to embark on my own journey into the historical record, to search for material the textbooks and previous scholars had overlooked. The first product of that search was Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America, which was published originally in 2000 and reissued in a revised and expanded edition in 2011. And now, as Jeff mentioned, it's being used in about 200 college courses around the country, and was made into a full-length documentary, which was finished sometime last year. And it opened originally in New York and Los Angeles, but starting this weekend, it opens around the country. I'm actually going to be flying out to Phoenix and Albuquerque and Santa Fe, where it opens this weekend, and then several other cities around the country. Just as Congress begins to take on this huge immigration debate, they couldn't come at a better time to have a more nuanced and comprehensive public discussion about the causes and the consequences of our modern immigration problem. The film, like the book, tells the complex story of various Latino migrants. And two key points that I've tried to make in it, and I think the film sort of faithfully tries to follow, is that you really cannot understand the huge explosion of the Latino population in the United States over the last 50, 60 years without first understanding the role of the United States government and United States business in Latin America over the past 150 years. And that they are inextricably bound together in one story of the relations between the United States and Latin America, since both regions achieved their independence. And I think the other key point I try to make is that the vast changes that are occurring in the United States in terms of the Latino population are not ours alone. They're shared by all the advanced industrial countries of the world, whether it's France or England or Germany or Italy, who are all going through their own processes of confronting huge demographic changes in their populations as the subjects of their former colonies have increasingly come to the metropolis. Well, several years after Harvest of Empire, I decided to tackle my profession itself. I was tired of personally witnessing the relentless encroachment of entertainment into the realm of hard news, frustrated by how we are exposed in this country on a daily basis to more news and information than any people in history. Yet the American people remain so remarkably misinformed about the world around them. Actually, so disinformed. For as Neil Postman said in his classic, Amusing Ourselves to Death, to be disinformed is to be misinformed while actually believing you have all the facts. When more than 2/3 of the American people believed on the eve of the Iraq invasion that Saddam Hussein had something to do with the 9/11 attacks, something is profoundly wrong with the job our nation's journalists are doing. When on so many issues that affect our world today, whether it's climate change, genetically modified foods, the war on terrorism, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the American people see things one way and the rest of the world sees it another way. Something is fundamentally wrong with all the news that we receive. I was frustrated as well that despite all the progress in civil rights and equal opportunity the past 50 years, the news media keep depicting racial and ethnic minorities in such a one-sided, stereotypical, and negative fashion, provoking deep resentment, even fury, among people of color in particular, who feel assaulted on a daily basis by the media, their hopes and dreams ignored, their contributions erased, their social problems magnified. And meanwhile, broad swaths of the general public have a growing disdain for the news media. During my career, I've been lucky to work in all the great streams of American journalism. Most people envision the media as primarily the commercial or corporate media, an advertiser-financed model of journalism that has existed from the days of the early colonial printers. But there is another critical stream of the American media, one celebrated and cultivated here at the Park Center, what some call the alternative, non-commercial, dissident press, which has its own grand tradition, dating back to the working men's press of the 1830s, the muckrakers at the turn of the 20th century, the community and public broadcasters of the 1950s and 1960s, the new left press of the 1970s, and today's progressive bloggers and news outlets like Democracy Now! And Grit News and Grit TV and Real News and Workers Independent News Service and Common Dreams. But finally, there is a third great stream in American news with its own amazing saga, what is most often referred to as the ethnic and minority press. During the 1970s, as a leader of the Young Lords, I edited our weekly bilingual newspaper, Palante. And a decade later, I had the privilege of helping to found and edit a bilingual weekly newspaper for the Latino community of Philadelphia, Enfoque Comunal. One of my other great frustrations was how these three great streams of the American press, the commercial media, the dissident and alternative media, and the press of people of color, have not only operated independently of each other, but often disconnected from and oblivious to each other's existence. At a certain point, I came to the realization that despite the decades I had devoted to what in my mind was an honorable profession, American journalism was failing the people, and the few jewel-like news operations that still survived were being overwhelmed and buried by all the garbage. Worse, I had no idea how to reverse these trends because I did not fully understand the industry that I was a part of, our system of news. Did not understand how it had developed and had no idea what forces and levers could help transform it for the better. And when I speak of a system of news, I do not mean to imply there is some sinister conspiracy at work, coordinated by some unseen cabal. Rather, the media, like all institutions within our society, arose and evolved from the nation's inception out of the interplay of class, racial, and gender conflicts, and through the pressure of competing circles of business, labor, and citizens groups on government media policy. So with my co-author, Joseph Torres, I attempted to begin to gradually piece together the puzzle of this enormous media system and how it came to be, and how it could possibly be changed. And we came across and agreed that there appeared to be several key dynamics at play in the construction of our media system. First is the historic role played by technology. The U.S. media system has experienced repeated waves of technological change in mass communication, but each new technology has overturned or destabilized the existing order of information delivery. Second is government policy. As each new technology undermined the existing communication system, government leaders were called upon to fashion new laws and regulations for the smooth functioning of media. Those leaders often had to respond to competing demands from old and new media owners, other business interests, as well as the needs of labor, ordinary citizens, and racial minorities, to balance private interests and public good. Third is the question of how information is best disseminated in a democracy. We found that the hallmark of each new media policy debate throughout U.S. history has been the issue of whether a centralized or decentralized system of mass communications best strengthens democratic institutions. And fourth is the news media's role in shaping a national narrative, a national identity. Debates over mass communications policy in the United States have always been, when everything else is stripped away, a battle over control of the narrative, over what sectors of society are able to utilize freedom of the press to contribute to the collective story. And what I'm going to do is try to go through some of the particulars of what we uncovered and sought to document in the book through and attempting to use some of the slide presentations that take off to some of the further remarks I'm going to make. In the United States, we don't have a problem with censorship. We have a problem that the American people are drowning in news and information. 1,400 daily newspapers, 12,000 radio stations, 1,200 television stations, news at 5, news at 6, news at 10, news at 11, 24-hour cable news shows, 24-hour business cable news, 24-hour news, 24-hour sports cable news, hundreds and thousands of internet websites available to us at any hour of the moment of the day on any contraption the electronics manufacturers can produce. Yet, despite this enormous amount of information, public confidence in mainstream media is at an all-time low. So why did our system of news develop the way it did? The conclusion that we reached was that it didn't have to be this way, it wasn't preordained, and it certainly wasn't as a result of the operation of a free market system. But rather, government policies played a key role in the shaping of our news media system from the very beginning. What Paul Stark says in his creation of the media, the constitutive decisions that were made by lawmakers, usually in response to advances in information and communications technology. And it included discounted postal rates, government printing contracts, the development of government sponsorship of research into new communications technology. Remember Samuel Morse's telegraph? Was the first telegraph was paid for by the United States Congress, stringing the first line from Baltimore to Washington. The funding of the National Science Foundation and the Defense Department for the initial research into the Internet. At every stage, taxpayers have helped to fund the development of new communications technologies, and it was government decisions that allowed that to happen. Intellectual property laws, copyright laws, the creation of the Federal Radio Commission in 1927 and the Federal Communications Commission in 1934, and the development of municipal monopolies for cable companies to allow one cable company in every locality to be the provider of cable service to these localities. These were all decisions made by our political leaders about how news and information will flow in a democracy. And I'd like to especially concentrate on the first great decision because it really is instructive as to how political decisions can affect the kind of media system that we have. And that was the decision of the United States government to create the first Internet. Not the current Internet, the first Internet, better known as the United States Postal System. In 1792, the Congress enacted the First Postal Act, creating the United States Postal System. There was a major debate in the Congress as to how that system would operate. Because you must understand, and those of you who've studied some of the works of Wayne Fuller or Richard Johns on the postal system know that the main job of the United States Postal System for the first more than 100 years was not the delivery of letters and correspondence. It was the delivery of newspapers. The people couldn't buy the paper on a local corner of downtown in those days. There weren't that many downtowns. Individual printers did not have their own delivery systems. And so early on in the history of the country, the founders decided that to keep this new republic together, these 13 colonies turned states spread over huge territory. They needed a means of communication for the people, and that the postal system was going to provide this ability for all of the citizens of the Republic to stay informed. And therefore that the postal system, through delivering newspapers, was going to provide the glue, the information glue, for the fledgling Republic. Big debate arises. Costs a lot of money to deliver newspapers compared to mail. They weigh a lot more. Who's going to pay for it? Is it going to be at the market price, or is it going to be at a discounted price or for free? And many of the founders, Washington, Jefferson, favored free delivery of newspapers because they felt that the dissemination of information was so critical to the maintenance of the Republic that the government should subsidize the delivery of newspapers completely. Madison and others felt that it should be at market rates. Finally, as often happens in the United States, they reached a compromise. It would be at subsidized rates, something called the second-class postage, so that all newspapers would be delivered and all printed literature would be delivered at less than the market cost, but not at full cost. That was an extraordinary decision that shaped the creation of the greatest newspaper culture in history in this country. By the early 1800s, the United States had more newspapers per capita than any country in the world, and virtually every town in America had not only one newspaper, had several newspapers, because as long as a printer could print the paper, the government would deliver it. And the government built the postal roads to connect the country so that it could deliver newspapers anywhere. The postal system before the Civil War was the single largest employer in the federal government. There were more people working for the U.S. postal system than were in the United States Army until the Civil War. And 90% of the traffic of the postal system into the 20th century was newspapers. You could argue that the main job of the United States government for the first 100 years was the delivery of newspapers to its people. As a result, you had an informed citizenry, you had competing political newspapers in almost every town, and there was a rich diversity of viewpoints. There was an astonishing number of African American and Latino and Asian American newspapers that developed in the 19th century. There were 25 Spanish language newspapers in New Orleans before the Civil War, including a daily, Patria, over 30 African American newspapers, there were 25 Chinese language newspapers before 1900 in the United States, including the Sacramento Chinese Daily News, 1855, the first Chinese language daily in the world. There was a Chinese language daily newspaper in Sacramento before there was a Chinese language daily newspaper in China. So you had this, again, because the government delivered the papers, it allowed the opportunity for this enormous newspaper culture to develop in the country. That was a political decision made by the founders about how information would flow in a democracy. About 50 years later, when Morse develops the telegraph, the new technology subverts the existing order. Once again, Congress is faced with a decision. How will this new technology contribute? Because now the telegraph news could travel instantly along telegraph lines. Morse felt the invention was so powerful that he wanted to sell all of his patents to the government, have the government take it over and run the telegraph just as it was running the postal system. But the political debate shifted, and it was decided to create a privately run system. And the government was going to stay out of the telegraph. There were hundreds of telegraph companies that developed across the United States, but after a few years, they started buying each other out, and by the mid-1860s, one company had gobbled everyone else up. That company became the first industrial monopoly in the United States. That company's name was Western Union. And Western Union became a huge gatekeeper to the information flow in the country. Western Union creates an alliance with the fledgling Associated Press, a co-op of newspaper publishers in New York City, to give the publishers of AP newspapers discounted rates on its lines in exchange for all of the newspapers agreeing never to criticize the Western Union monopoly of the telegraph. And you have the creation of the first information cartel in American history, the Western Union AP information cartel. Throughout the late 19th century, Americans kept protesting the high prices of sending telegrams in the United States compared to other countries. But the press would never cover it because the AP was locked up with Western Union. Dozens and dozens of resolutions were introduced into Congress to break up the Western Union monopoly, and it never went anywhere. The only thing that broke up the monopoly of Western Union and the AP was a new technology called radio. In the early 1900s, radio upsets the existing order, requires the government to step in once again, because now there are hundreds of radio stations, amateur radio operators taking to the airwaves, African Americans, Latinos, a diversity, church groups, local governments, everyone was into the new radio craze. The government stepped in and created the Federal Radio Commission first, and then the Federal Communications Commission, and ended up handing over all the important frequencies to a couple of fledgling new radio companies called NBC and CBS. And you had the re-centralization of information flow through a few networks. Eventually, the NBC networks, the Supreme Court rules that it's too big of a monopoly, and the Supreme Court forces NBC to break up its red network and its blue network, and you have the birth of ABC out of the breakup of the NBC combine. So a new technology comes along, cable, because television was really an extension of radio. The same people ran the same networks that ran radio, ran television. Cable offers new opportunities now for local involvement. Promises that cable was commercial free. It was sold originally as commercial free because you paid a monthly fee and you didn't have to worry about commercials. So how long that lasted. And you had the same situation with cable that happened with the early telegraph. Many companies at the beginning, a few buying up all the others. So today, 2 companies control cable in America, Comcast and Time Warner. And now you have the 5th technology, the development of the internet, which has once again upset the existing, the old order, and forced the government to step in over the last 10 years, 15 years, a series of decisions by the federal government and Congress to decide how the internet is going to operate. And those decisions are still being fought out, some of them. But that really summarizes the great key moments in the development of the American media system. The creation of the postal system, the advent of the telegraph, early radio, the development of cable television, the evolution of the internet. 5 key junctures in American history where communications technology has upset the existing order, the government has had to develop new rules of operation, and huge battles break out in the society over how will the system function. And in every one of these battles, the same question has arisen. Is democracy best served by a centralized or decentralized system of news? We conclude in the book that only in times when the political decisions were made to decentralize media flow, the early post office, early radio, early cable, and early internet, right? Did you have a flowering of dissident alternative views? Did people of color have an opportunity to be heard and to speak and to be able to get their messages out? And every time there's been a centralization of our system of news and information. The telegraph, the creation of the networks, the buying up Comcast and Time Warner of all of the other cable companies. In each of these times when the system has attempted to move in a centralized direction, that's when alternative, dissident voices have been shut off from the media and have been reduced in their ability to speak and be heard. So that a decentralized system of news and information is critical to a true flowering of democracy in America. And I think that's one of the central, not only the historical development of the media system, but the key question that has always arisen at every moment of that historical development, that we have finally put together into our theory of how the media in America have developed. And it took a long time, took about 8 or 10 years of research in addition to a whole lifetime of working in the system to try to understand it. But I finally feel that I have a somewhat of a rudimentary, basic grasp of how the system evolved. And not only how it evolved, but how it is possible to pressure for change. The key moments of pressure for change come at the junctures when the new technology comes in and the old order is in trouble. And those are the moments when you have an opportunity to affect the discourse and affect the political decisions that are made in the construction of the media system. Anyway, the other big thing that we try to deal with in the book is what the title more refers to. I think what we've done in terms of the evolution of the media system will ultimately be more important long term. But I think in terms of understanding that race and racial conflict have always been a central issue in the American news media. Race and racial conflict is often sort of like, oh yeah, you talk about the important things, and then you also talk about, well, yeah, there's this discrimination, there's these problems that we have to deal with, almost as if race and racial coverage are a side issue. We discovered that they have been a central issue in the American news media since the first newspaper in America. Public Occurrences, 1690, Boston, Massachusetts. Benjamin Harris, Anabaptist printer who fled England after having some problems with censorship in England, moves to Boston, sets up a print shop, and then a few years later begins to publish the first newspaper. It only lasted for one issue, because the Massachusetts Governing Council immediately shut it down after it had some critical remarks about the British governor at the time. But even in that first issue, 3 pages long, the template was established for a key aspect of the content of American newspapers. 5 separate articles in this first newspaper, the bulk of the content of the newspaper was intelligence to the settlers of the Massachusetts colony about the Native Americans, about what the Native Americans were up to, warning about stories about attacks of Native Americans against members of the Massachusetts colony, about the alliances between certain different native tribes, and the French and the English. And the main topic of conversation was Native Americans. And so it became, throughout the colonial period, a huge portion of the actual content of colonial era newspapers was either intelligence to the settlers about Native Americans or information about Africans. Some examples. The second newspaper in America, John Campbell's Boston Newsletter, started in 1704.
the Boston Evening Post. This was great because it was both in the South, it was usually about slave insurrections or individual violence of slaves against their masters. In the North, it was about social problems created by free blacks. So you see here the Boston Evening Post saying, the great disorders committed by Negroes who are permitted by their imprudent masters to be out late at night has determined several sober and substantial housekeepers to walk about the town in the sore part of the night. A town watch, a town watch in Boston to provide surveillance over the free black community. Or the New York Weekly Post, a little bit more stronger medicine that the newspaper was praising. Mordecai Noah's, one of the big publishers in the early 1800s in New York, talking about the problems that African Americans, from his perspective, were creating in New York City. These kinds of accounts of the native populations were frequent in many newspapers. Throughout the 1700s, as much as a third of the content of colonial era newspapers was about Native Americans, another huge portion about African Americans. So slavery, Indian troubles, violence by Native Americans or Africans against the white population was a huge part of the discourse. And obviously, all of this was being geared to the white settlers of the country. One of the most enlightened publishers of the late 19th century was Horace Greeley, his Tribune. He was anti-slavery, a friend of Lincoln, but Greeley's views toward both Native Americans and Asians were extremely racist, and he actually supported a lot of development of anti-Asian bias in the country. So these are some of the stories, the news accounts that give us an indication that race was central to our press from the very beginning. My favorite story, and I mentioned this earlier this evening in a Q&A, was the Wilmington Troubles of 1898. This is a cartoon from a New York newspaper talking about or depicting those troubles, and what you see is you see a bunch of African Americans with guns shooting at whites. This was how New Yorkers heard about the Wilmington Troubles of 1898. What actually happened in November of 1898, this is in Wilmington, North Carolina, majority black city, tail end of Reconstruction, and one of the few Reconstruction governments that still had a majority black city council. And 2,000 armed whites march into town. They burn down the local black newspaper, Alexander Manley's Wilmington Herald. They then proceed to shoot up the black community. Dozens of people were killed. Hundreds of African Americans fled the city of Wilmington over the next few days. It was the only successful armed coup in American history. President McKinley did not send any federal troops. No National Guard were called out. No one was arrested. The legally elected leadership of Wilmington was not restored to office. The amazing thing about the entire incident was that it was led, organized, and instigated by the local publisher, Josephus Daniels, editor and publisher of the News and Observer. He was one of the most celebrated Southern editors of his time, a prolific writer, so prolific that his autobiography is in 3 volumes. And he boasts in his autobiography of the role that his newspaper played in the Wilmington events. He talks about how they would
he would meet with the leaders of the white vigilante group in his newspaper offices, and they would plan what articles to put in the paper every day as they were preparing for the coup to stir up the white population of Wilmington against the elected leaders of the town, the elected black council members. He boasts of their burning down the newspaper of Alexander Manly. And here's a photo of the mob after they burned down the newspaper, posing outside of Manly's newspaper. Now you think, well, Woodrow Wilson is some crank Southern editor. I'm sorry, Josephus Daniels is some crank Southern editor. Well, he wasn't a crank Southern editor. He was a highly regarded populist. He railed against the railroad monopolies. He was against the Duke family and his vast holdings. He was a confidant of William Jennings Bryan. He was a strategist for Woodrow Wilson. When Woodrow Wilson is elected president, he names Josephus Daniels Secretary of the Navy. Josephus Daniels was our Secretary of the Navy during World War I. As Secretary of the Navy, he mentored a young undersecretary named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When FDR is elected president, he names Josephus Daniels U.S. Ambassador to Mexico. So he was a major political, democratic, populist figure throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. He was also a murderer, a racist, a newspaper publisher who boasted of burning down the black newspaper in his own town. About 7 or 8 years ago, the state of North Carolina appointed the Wilmington Race Commission to research what had happened back in 1898. And you can get the full report of the Wilmington Race Commission. That's where this photo comes from. On the internet, just Google Wilmington 1898 Race Riot, and you'll see the entire report indicting every single major newspaper in North Carolina, in addition to the News and Observer, in instigating this coup. And all of the major newspapers in North Carolina have since issued public apologies for their role. Now, it's all well and good that the Race Commission did its report and that the newspapers apologized, but it came 100 years after the incident, for which no one was ever held responsible. No one was ever indicted, no one was ever arrested, and it was the end of democracy in North Carolina until the civil rights era of our time. And like this example, we document in the book so many examples of the role of the press, not merely in misrepresenting and stereotyping people of color, but of actually being instigators, fomenters of racial violence. And this is a photo of Josephus Daniels, our Secretary of the Navy, on one of the battleships with his wife. These are some other examples. The African American mutiny in Houston, Texas, of soldiers in Houston, Texas, which as we explained in the book, was actually a result of the East St. Louis riot that had occurred a few weeks before. This is the lynching of Will Brown, and we talk about the role of the Omaha Bee, the most respected Republican newspaper west of the Mississippi in those days, in instigating the mob violence that led to the lynching of Will Brown. This is Pedro Gonzalez. Actually, he was a singer, and his story is very instructive for our day. Pedro Gonzalez was a Mexican immigrant who, in the early 1930s, had some terrific hit records, and he was hired as a DJ. Well, not a DJ. He was actually performing on the air by a Los Angeles radio station in the early 1930s. He had a group called Los Madrugadores, the early risers. So he was hired to go on the station from 4 a.m. as the farm workers were getting ready to go into the fields and sing and play music to the farm workers. This was in the 1930s. The Depression had hit. The Hearst newspapers were launching a campaign to pressure the government to deport all these Mexicans that were stealing jobs from so many unemployed Americans. So Herbert Hoover initiates a mass deportation program over a period of about 18 months. Between 500,000 and 1 million Mexicans were just loaded onto trains and shipped out of the country by the government. Many of them were actually American citizens, but they were just picked up in huge roundups, much worse than anything Joe Arpaio does these days in Arizona. So Pedro Gonzalez, seeing this, decides he's going to turn his radio show into a show to expose the mistreatment of the Mexican farm workers by the government. He's promptly arrested by the Los Angeles district attorney and charged with raping an underage girl, and he's convicted and sentenced to 1 to 50 years in San Quentin prison. This is the front page of L'Opinion in Los Angeles on the day that Pedro Gonzalez is sentenced, because he was a big figure in those days in the Latino community. Pedro Gonzalez arrives in San Quentin prison and immediately organizes the first hunger strike of the inmates of San Quentin against prison conditions. He's in jail for 8 years, and in 1940, the young woman he was convicted of raping recants her testimony, admits that she was put up to it by the district attorney's office, and Pedro Gonzalez is released from jail. He's immediately put on a train and deported to Tijuana, where he remained as a radio announcer for decades. Into the 1990s, he remained as a radio announcer in Tijuana, and finally dying, I think, in 1996. Now, this is the Los Angeles Times from 1943, the Zoot Suit riots. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Zoot Suit riots, when young sailors rampaged through the Latino community of Los Angeles, attacking the Pachucos, the young gang members that they believed were creating problems. Here's a photo from the Library of Congress of the soldiers and sailors walking through the streets looking for Mexicans to attack. The Los Angeles Times article, as you'll see, you can read it, it says, Zoot suiters learn lessons in fights with servicemen. Does that sound like it's taken aside? What you see is the photo of a bunch of Zoot suiters, because the police were only arresting Mexicans and African Americans. Obviously, none of the Navy people or the soldiers were arrested. This, on the other hand, is the front page the same day of L'Opinion, the Spanish language newspaper, which says the battle of the sailors and the Pachucos in Belvedere, and then one of the other subheads is the entire neighborhood is alarmed at the violence. So what we've done throughout the book is try to take major events, especially racial conflicts, and shown how the mainstream or commercial press covered those versus how the independent African American or Latino press covered them, just to give you a sense of the disparities of the coverage of the same events. Because one of the things we've tried to document in this book is the fascinating 200-year history of journalists of color to tell a different story. And it's a history that's been largely hidden, not deliberately. In most cases, libraries and universities never archived these newspapers. And so the scholars who went to work had, unless they really were intent on finding a different perspective, found it very difficult to find copies of newspapers that would tell a different story. For instance, the first Spanish language newspaper in the United States, El Mississippi, there's only, in New Orleans, 1808, there's only 2 known issues that have survived, even though it was published for 2 years. Felix Varela, the Cuban Catholic priest who edited one of the earliest exiled newspapers, El Habanero in Philadelphia in 1824. He was anti-slavery, pro-independence. He couldn't publish a newspaper in Cuba against Spain, so he moved to New York and then eventually landed in Philadelphia and published his newspaper there and would smuggle it back into Cuba. John Russworm and Samuel Cornish, better known, obviously, the editors of the first black newspaper in the United States, Freedom's Journal, 1827. In their first edition of the newspaper, they wrote, "We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us." From the press and the pulpit, we have suffered much from being incorrectly represented. That was 1827 in New York City. You could write that today. Mary Ann Shadd Caddy, the first great African-American female editor, who eventually fled to Canada after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed and edited the Provincial Freeman's Journal in Canada. Elias Boudinot, the first publisher of the first Native American newspaper in the United States, the Cherokee Phoenix, in 1828, was published in both English and Cherokee. And the Cherokee didn't even have a written language until the 1820s, when Sequoyah developed an alphabet for the Cherokee language. Within a few years, the entire nation, Cherokee Nation, had become literate in Cherokee, and they were producing their own newspaper. And it lasted for 8 years until the Georgia militia attacked the newspaper and destroyed the press. La Patria, the first Spanish language daily in the United States, again in New Orleans. New Orleans was the center of the Latino press in America throughout the 19th century. That paper, too, or its successor, La Unión, was destroyed by a mob in 1853 when the editors criticized a filibuster expedition of largely Americans in Cuba, and a mob attacked the newspaper and then also attacked the Latin Quarter of New Orleans. Because he wrote in Spanish, he covered all the major events of the late 19th century: lynchings, attacks on Native Americans, Haymarket Square. He was there for all of those events, covering them in Spanish for Latin American newspapers. Great dispatches, totally unknown in the United States in terms of his writings on the United States. Wang Ching-fu, who edited the Chinese American in the 1880s in New York City. Jovita Hidalgo, my favorite. Jovita Hidalgo, one of the first great Latina journalists. Jovita lived in Laredo, Texas. Her whole family was in the newspaper business. They edited La Crónica, the great Laredo newspaper, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And she was constantly exposing all of the abuses that were occurring against Mexican Americans in Texas, in South Texas, along the border. For instance, because I think she's I think that somebody should make a movie about Jovita Hidalgo. But in June 1910, La Crónica condemned a decision of the school board in the West Texas town of San Angelo to admit only white children to a new school that had just opened its doors. According to the paper, the board had assigned all Tejano Mexicano children to the town's older rundown school, a decision that had prompted 300 Latino parents to organize a boycott of classes. La Crónica praised the boycott as, quote, a dignified protest. A few weeks later, the paper condemned the pervasive segregation in Texas public schools, warning, quote, "It is in the interest of this country to give education to the youth of whichever race, to remove men from the obscure hole of ignorance. The law concedes to the inhabitants of Texas equal rights and identical privileges. Then in what is based this odious distinction?" Later that year, a young Mexican named Antonio Rodriguez was accused of killing an Anglo-American woman on a ranch near Rock Springs, Texas. A crowd of whites immediately surrounded the jailhouse, pulled Rodriguez from his cell, tied him to a tree, and burned him to death. In a front-page story titled "Barbarism," Jovita Haddad and La Crónica blasted both the mob and the sheriff's deputies for failing to prevent the jail break-in. She wrote, quote, "The crowd cheered when the flames engulfed his contorted body. They did not even turn away at the smell of his burning flesh, and I wondered if they even knew his name." So Jovita kept writing about voting rights, school desegregation, lynchings, and then in 1913, when Woodrow Wilson sends troops to the border in the midst of the Mexican Revolution, she blasts the federal government's sending of troops. The Texas Rangers ride into town. They surround her newspaper, and they order her to shut it down. Of course, she stands in the doorway, reads them the Constitution. And if any of you have ever been to Laredo, it's about 95% Mexican. So soon the entire town turned out. The Rangers were surrounded. They pulled back and left, but then they came back that night when everyone was gone, and they destroyed her press. So one of the things we've tried to do in this book is tell the stories of these courageous journalists, Pedro Gonzalez and Wong Chin Fu and Ida B. Wells and Jose Marti and Jovita Haddad and Ricardo Flores Magón and David Ruggles and Marianne Shad Carey, because these are heroes of the American media just as, and sometimes more so, than the Horace Greeleys and the James Gordon Bennetts and the Walter Cronkites and all these other people that we've so often heard about. Ricardo Flores Magón, of course, was the anarchist editor who published newspapers in St. Louis and in El Paso, in San Antonio, and was jailed 3 times by the federal government under sedition acts, finally died in Leavenworth prison, all at the behest of the Mexican government who wanted Ricardo Flores Magón silenced. Robert L. Vann, in my opinion, the greatest African-American journalist of the 20th century. Editor and publisher of the Pittsburgh Courier for more than 30 years. The Courier, along with the Chicago Defender, were the 2 great black newspapers of the 20th century. And in the early 1930s, Robert L. Vann begins a campaign against these 2. The original Amos and Andy, most popular radio show of its time, and a blackface minstrel program that demeaned African Americans on a daily basis, as millions of Americans tuned into Amos and Andy every single night on the NBC radio network. And Vann uses his newspaper to launch a campaign against Amos and Andy, beseeching African Americans across the country to send in letters to the Federal Radio Commission, blasting the program. And he then published every day the letters. And when you read these letters of ordinary African Americans talking about the impact of that show on their lives and on perceptions of them, you realize the vein that Robert L. Vann touched in this campaign. And he kept on talking about and urging people to send in letters 700,000 people sent letters to the Federal Radio Commission opposing the Amos and Andy show, and yet the commission, I mean, forget about free speech issues, the commission didn't even bother to answer or respond to any of the letters or any of the concerns. But Van didn't stop with that. He then began a big campaign to integrate baseball. And he and the black press were instrumental in breaking down the color barrier in American sports, and then covered on a daily basis the exploits of Jackie Robinson in his saga to integrate baseball. Or Edelman Reed, whose family published the Muskogee Times in Oklahoma, another Native American journalist, and also in Wyoming, was known as the Sunshine Lady, had a first advice show on Wyoming radio. These are all some of the key figures among people of color. Jesse Blayton, owner of the first black-owned radio station in the United States, WERD in Atlanta. Towering figure. People don't understand the key role that black radio played in the civil rights movement in America. There were two institutions that really helped propel the civil rights movement to national prominence: the black churches and black radio. WERD in Atlanta was on the second floor of a building in the black community. On the first floor of the building was the headquarters of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The black DJs would later tell the story that whenever Martin Luther King wanted to get out a major announcement to the black community, he would grab a broom or a stick and pound the ceiling upstairs for WERD. The disc jockeys would then lower the mic out the window, down, and King would pick it up. And then they'd first say, "We have an important announcement from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King of the SCLC." And they'd lower the mic downstairs. King would make his pronouncement of this demonstration or that activity, and then he'd send the mic back upstairs. That was how close the relationship was between black radio and the civil rights movement. And in every city across America, it was black DJs in Detroit, in Philadelphia, in Boston, in St. Louis. It was the black DJs who spread the word, the black announcers who spread the words of protest and of the civil rights movement. And they were the megaphone of the civil rights movement. Just as if you read Schlesinger or any of the early histories of the American Revolution, you realize the key role played by the colonial printers in fomenting independence and anti-British sentiment. And after all, the Boston Tea Party was organized right out of the newspaper offices of Benjamin Eddy's, the publisher in Boston, and Sam Adams and all the others met at the newspaper office to don their Indian gear before they went out to dump the tea in Boston Harbor. So it's not as if we're talking advocacy journalism distinct when you look at the development of our own press and the advocacy role that the early colonial printers played in their freedom struggle. So these are some of the key figures. Domingo Reyes, who led the first national Latino boycott of television ads, the Frito Bandito ads in the 1960s. And of course, Ruben Salazar, the great Los Angeles Times writer, then he left the Los Angeles Times after a distinguished career as a foreign correspondent and as a reporter to go and start a fledgling news station, KMEX TV, a Spanish language television station, where he began to really pioneer investigative reporting in the Latino community. And Salazar, of course, was not just a figure in covering journalism. He was also one who sought to bring journalists together and developed the first organization of Chicanos in media. And in the in 1970, there was a meeting in New York of the Chicano Media Council with major newspaper executives, including Katharine Graham of the Washington Post and others. And Salazar made this plea to the media owners back then. I just want to read you this, and then I'm going to wrap it up. We ask you, almost beg you, to help us inform this nation about the tragic plight of 8 million invisible Chicanos, whose lives often parallel those of black people. There is much bitterness in our Mexican-American community, gentlemen, an ever-increasing bitterness against school systems that psychologically mutilate the Chicano child, against certain police who habitually harass our brown brothers, against local and federal governments that apparently respond only to violence. Consequently, there are some Chicanos who have finally concluded that we must have a Watts-type riot to catch your attention, to force the establishment to pay heed. We prayerfully hope this won't happen. We hope that reason will finally prevail, that you leaders of the national media will help us to push for the kinds of governmental reforms and changes in public attitudes that will help to better the lot of the much ignored Chicano. In all candor, gentlemen, I can't say I'm entirely hopeful. It may be too late to forestall the violence of long-festering frustration, but I think we should try. That was Ruben Salazar talking in the summer of 1970 to media executives and the new Chicano Media Council. A few weeks later, on August 29th, 1970, there was a protest in Los Angeles, an anti-war protest of the Chicano community. It was called the Chicano Moratorium. And thousands of Chicanos from across the West and the Southwest converged in Los Angeles. There was a confrontation with police as the police charged the stage to prevent Corky Gonzalez, one of the big Chicano leaders at that time, from speaking on the podium. And it turned into a full-scale riot. You know, police cars were trashed, hundreds of people were arrested, and the police started firing tear gas into the crowd. And Salazar was covering that event for KMEX TV. He and his cameraman at one point went into a bar to get away from the troubles and the Silver Dollar Cafe, and a deputy sheriff fired a tear gas canister into the bar, and it hit Salazar directly in the head and killed him instantly. It was had a major impact on the Latino community because Salazar was one of the first Latino reporter at the LA Times, had won many awards, and was really one of the most respected Latino journalists of his day. But the very thing that he had warned a few weeks before that was possibly going to happen actually happened, and then took his life. So many Latino organizations around the country now all have these Ruben Salazar awards. The postal system issued a Ruben Salazar stamp, but he's another one in the long line of journalists of color who have really gone way beyond in sacrificing to assure a more just media system in America, and they deserve their due in some acknowledgement of what they've contributed to American journalism. Finally, this last photo is of the 4 black reporters who won the only racial discrimination suit against a media company in American history. They were led by Dave Hardy. He's the tall guy in the back. And there had been many racial discrimination lawsuits filed previous to the New York Daily News suit at the Washington Post. A suit had been filed at the Associated Press, at the New York Times. But all of the previous lawsuits had been settled by the companies out of court. This was the only one that actually went to trial. And the Tribune Company took a big gamble and decided to go to trial, and they lost. The 3 reporters were paid $3.2 million, or awarded $3.2 million by the jury. And it sent shockwaves through the American media establishment. Because if the New York Daily News could lose a lawsuit, almost any newspaper or television station could possibly lose a lawsuit. So in the years after that, American newspapers began to increasingly hire more racial minorities. I came to the New York Daily News in December of 1987, about 4 or 5 months after this lawsuit, because I was called in Philadelphia by the editor saying, listen, we'd like to hire you to bring you in to write a column. It was, I believe, a direct result of the fact the paper had lost that lawsuit. So that Dave Hardy died about a year ago, but the four of them are also heroes of the American press. Joan Shepard, Coswell Vaughn, because they stood up and went in for years. Their case dragged on for years. First in the Human Rights Commission, and then finally when it got to the courts. And the Daily News attempted to besmirch all of their careers in an attempt to defeat them, but they prevailed and they were successful in their lawsuit. Anyway, so these are some of the heroes that we've tried to tell their stories, to bring them to life in the book. So we've done two things with this book. We've tried to create a theory of the development of the news media in America, and we've tried to put the racial narrative in its proper context within the American news media and tell the stories of the heroes and the villains, white and black and Latino, because there were many white editors and publishers who stood up against the tide and tried to tell a different story, and we tell their stories as well. And hopefully it will inspire budding young journalists in the future to believe that there's a lot more to journalism than Entertainment Tonight or Fox News or some of the less desirable aspects of our industry, and say that there still is noble work that can be done in journalism, in the commercial media, in the alternative media, and in the ethnic media as well. Anyway, thank you for being so attentive, and I'll be glad to take any questions.
Have we heard in such a coherent fashion about all these heroes and heroines of independent media on Earth? Let's hear it again. Especially students. We have a mic here. I'd like to see some students line up and get things started, and then members of the community can ask questions. Here's the first questioner. You can self-moderate.
Okay.
Hello. Thank you for your time and for the opportunity to ask you a question here today. My name is Ken Robertson, and I'm a queer Park student here at Ithaca College. During your presentation, you spoke about how during your early education, the history of Latino culture in America was completely ignored. Without asserting that ethnicity and sexuality are the same, I would also like to share that I too did not learn about the history of queer people, my people, in public school. I would like to ask you today if you believe queer journalists and media creators have a responsibility to draw on their own cultural experiences of marginalization and oppression in their professional pursuits, as you have done throughout your extensive and influential career.
Yes, I absolutely do think that they must draw on their experiences, because all of us, it's the job of a journalist to go out into the world and report stuff that other people can't directly see because they're working, they're raising their families, they're doing other things. And yet, we all provide a perspective of that reality based on our own upbringing, our own education, the class and racial group and ethnic or group that we were born into, and I think that all views of reality are necessarily one-sided. And what you try to do in journalism is provide as comprehensive a perspective as you can, but you've got to start from your own experience. And so whether it's a Latino or African American, or it's gay, lesbian person, everyone has to draw on their own experiences to inform how they see reality, and hopefully out of the different perspectives that we provide, the reader or the listener or the viewer will cull from all of our reports and decide what is true for them, what is real for them. All we can do is try to be as complete and fair in our presentation as we can be, but we all are going to be necessarily subjective in how we see that reality.
Do you think that a part of that is to come out publicly in the public sphere?
Yes, although I think that's an individual decision, but absolutely, I think that coming up publicly in the public sphere and generating the necessary discussion and debate is critical, yes.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Blaze. I'm a sophomore TVR major. I'm just wondering what one most important thing in your experience in the industry that you think has made you successful. It's kind of a vague, broad question.
Not worrying about getting promoted. Too many people who enter the profession start out with grand ideas of changing the world, and then they get into the reality of a newsroom and the pressures that are put on them, not only in terms of the amount of time, uncompensated as well as compensated time that they're required to put in, but the editors and supervisors can really destroy your enthusiasm, and especially if you seek to rise up the chain. I entered journalism only to report and tell stories. I've never had an interest in being in any kind of management position, so therefore I never worried about what a particular editor thought of me, just as long as they respected me, or what they thought about my viewpoints or ideas. As long as I could keep bringing stories that no one else was bringing, I figured I had a value to whatever news operation I've worked for. In alternative and the dissident press, those kinds of competitive pressures are not as strong, but I feel that and I love working at Democracy Now! And I think we've been able to do incredible work over the years. But unfortunately, the dissident and alternative press still is being overwhelmed, by, as I said before, by all the garbage that's out there in the commercial press. So I see my responsibility not only to continue working in the dissident press, but more importantly, to wage the battle with the media workers who work in the commercial press, to be able to somehow or other gain greater say over their product, whether that's in unionization, whether that's in professional associations that are developed independent of the workplace, but that it's our industry, and we are the majority in the industry, and we should have a say in the content of the news that the American people receive, more than just we write it and you edit it, but also that we should have a say in how our news organizations function. So I've always believed that
90% of the people who enter commercial newsrooms are essentially good-hearted people, but they become afraid of the bosses, they become afraid of not being able to be promoted, they become afraid of being the only one pursuing a particular story and being considered crazy or out of touch, and so they get beaten down. I think what always helped me is my experience in the Young Lords and in social movements before I became a journalist, is that when you believe you're right, you just keep going, and until someone proves to you that you're wrong. Other than that, you've got to follow the stories that you believe are important, and you've got to report them the way you see them.
Thank you.
Hi. We're at one of those tipping points you talked about where the internet is taking over as the medium of news reporting from newspapers and televisions, and we're at that point where the decision's being made. Is it going to be centralized or is it going to be diverse? Can you talk a little bit about that decision and where we're headed?
Well, there are actually quite a few key questions still unresolved. Unfortunately, so much has already been resolved without the American public knowing what was going on. And we detail in the book the development of the United States internet policy, and through the three processes that the FCC call the computer inquiries, 1, 2, and 3. But I think the key issues that still the public can weigh in on, as obviously many of you know if you're Democracy Now! Listeners, is the issue of net neutrality. Net neutrality is critical for the ability of other voices to be heard on an equal basis with major media companies. Unfortunately, the Obama administration, which really owes its political power to the internet to a large degree, has basically cut the baby in half, and Obama's communications FCC Chairman Janikowski basically divided the question of net neutrality, maintained it for land-based cable, but removed it for mobile devices. And obviously, most of us are increasingly getting our internet through mobile devices, and will continue to do so in the future. And so that has to be reversed, and that probably has to be reversed by an act of Congress, because the Obama FCC doesn't seem like it's going to make any more major changes. So that's one big issue. The other big issue is the question of surveillance on the internet. That's huge. That's huge. The ability of governments and corporations to systematically track everything that we do, and that there's a big battle between the European Union and the United States over these issues now, and the American public needs to weigh in on the side of the Europeans on this issue to some degree, in terms of better privacy protections on the internet. The other big issue that doesn't get talked about as much is the issue of cable, of the public responsibility of cable operators. Again, Comcast and Time Warner now are the dominant companies in cable. Comcast is not only the largest cable provider in the United States, video provider, it's the largest internet service provider in the United States. And the big shift that's occurred in the media over the last 10, 15 years is that the content providers have been relegated in influence and power. The dominant forms of the dominant media companies in America today are those who control the pipes through which all content flows. It's the Comcasts, it's the Time Warners, it's the Googles and the Yahoos, and through their mobile devices, the Android phones and the iPhones, so that power has shifted. That's why you can have a Comcast buy the entire NBC Universal Telemundo network. That's why you can have a Cablevision buy the Newsday newspaper out in Long Island. Those who control the pipes are now buying the content themselves. So the real powers are no longer the New York Times and ABC and NBC and CBS. It's Comcast, Time Warner, Verizon, Apple, and to a lesser degree, Yahoo. But so these are the folks now that are that have to be confronted in terms of government policy over how news and information gets disseminated. And in the case of the cable companies, the future of public access is critical. People forget the promise of cable originally. It was going to liberate humanity. It was going to provide interactive democracy. It was going to do all this stuff that it never did. One of the few requirements that cable companies had for their monopolies over our public streets to string their lines was that they had to set aside a portion of their channels for government, university, state legislatures, public access. The original Time Warner franchise in New York City, for instance, there were 16 channels, 4 of them. 25% of the channels were for public use, right? That's when there were 16 channels. Today, Time Warner has 1,000 channels. So if they had the same percentage, there'd be 250, public access, non-commercial channels. Instead, they have 8 or 10 NBA Pass channels, and 6 or 7 HBO channels, and 6 or 7 Cinemax or Showtime channels, and still, in most of the markets, you still have maybe not 4, 8, or 9 public access channels. So even as the universe of channels has expanded, the portion reserved for public benefit and public use has grown percentage-wise very small. And they increasingly want to kick the public access channels up into the higher numbers rather than the lower numbers that they traditionally occupied. Best example is AT&T with their Uverse video service in places like Illinois. In the state of Illinois, there's one cable franchise for the entire state for AT&T, not one for each separate municipality, because AT&T bought the local state legislature. They now have public access on one channel. It's channel 99. You go to channel 99 on the Uverse system, and you then have a pull-down menu of all the municipalities in Illinois. Right? And you find on the pull-down menu your municipality. Then you click that municipality and you get what's the local government channel, what's the local university channel, what's the local public access channel. So out of 1,000 channels that AT&T has, they have ghettoized public access to one channel. And then you have to maneuver to find your local public access. That's extraordinary that was allowed to happen in a franchise agreement, that the legislature got away with it, that there was no public outcry over it. So we have to have a battle to reclaim public access. Because in the old days, you were paying $40 a month for cable. Now with triple play, some people pay $200 a month for cable, and especially if they have some of the extra channels, the premium channels that you get. It's an enormous bill that people pay for, and yet there's virtually little of that money dedicated to the public need. And in fact, I maintain that that's the key to a new model for financing media in America. That cable operations in America are gold mines. They are the modern-day equivalent of a gold mine. You sit there as a monopoly cable operator, and virtually everybody in your area pays you a monthly bill. And then you give out maybe 50 cents out of every monthly bill to the local public access, production company. You should be paying more of, the company should be paying more of their bill to fund public access because they've got a guaranteed revenue stream and they have a monopoly. They have a monopoly in every municipality in America, so they should pay. Same thing with cell phones and with satellite broadcasting. That's where the money is in media today. It's not as if there's no money in media. It's just not in the old legacy medias anymore. It's in the phones, the cell phones, and the cable companies.
Hi, I'm Gypsy. I'm a senior here at Ithaca College. I want to say thank you for coming. My question is it's a little more broad. It's more of an advice question. So there's a trend that the higher that people go, the more they forget about their communities and where they come from, and that they actually have to go back and work with the people that led them to the positions where they are. So my question is, for future Latinos like me, I'm hopefully a future lawyer, or future Latinos in journalism or the music industry, what is your advice to us so we won't get lost in this little cloud of fame or the justice system, so we can go back to our communities and actually work with them?
That's a tough question. It's, in the 70s, we used to have this saying that those who are not felled by real bullets will be felled by sugar-coated bullets. So there's a lot of sugar-coated bullets in America. Unfortunately, it really takes a lot of work because a lot of people actually think they're doing great work, and they don't realize that they themselves have been co-opted and forgotten their roots or compromised themselves. And I question myself every day as to what degree have I censored myself, not followed a story that I thought I should have followed. You just have to, I think you have to have certain guideposts for yourself about how change occurs in America. And I think one of the things that we do in the book is we show that virtually all major change in America results from people struggling and pressuring government and institutions to change. So you've got to sort of ingrain it in yourself that that's how change occurs in America, with the people in one way or another rise up and demand it. And then you've got to, as much as possible, constantly look for those folks who are trying to affect real substantive social change, rather than those who are trying to sort of position and jockey themselves over one particular legislation or one particular political leader, and constantly look for the social movements that are the real heart of change in America. But there's no guarantees that you won't get felled by a sugar-coated bullet.
Hopefully I won't. Gracias. Hi, my name is Christiana, and I just wanted to thank you for writing Harvest of Empire. My question is, do you have any advice for students who want to start a grassroots movement to challenge the media and communications center at our school, which in my experiences suppresses and silences counter-narratives and makes it difficult for budding journalists, filmmakers, and media makers of color to function and belong to these predominantly white spaces?
Yeah, you have to not be afraid to challenge and get people angry, and to have your voice heard, to pull together students who agree with you, and to try to articulate the kinds of changes you want. I remember when I was a young reporter in Philadelphia in the late 1970s, there was about 4 or 5 black reporters, and I was the only Latino reporter at the time, and they were all men, right? So we formed our little Third World Caucus, and we began to pressure the management for some changes. And one of our first demands was that they should hire a minority woman to work at the paper, because it was all men
if the few photographers and reporters that were African American and myself. So they go and hire this young woman out of the St. Petersburg Times. Comes to Philadelphia Daily News. We're all glad. We finally got a female reporter, a minority reporter, and we greet her and we said, "Oh, terrific! They hired you, and we're going to have this meeting of the Third World Caucus." And she says, "Caucus? I don't join caucuses. I don't believe in that kind of stuff. I don't believe in pressuring the management." we said, "Oh yeah, how do you think you got here?" It's you've got to articulate your demands, but even sometimes when you articulate your demands and you win them, they turn out not to be what you expected. We then actually pressured management further. We wanted to have a minority editor at the paper, which we had never had. And they eventually hired a young up-and-coming executive of the Knight Ridder chain by the name of Jay Harris, who later actually had a very distinguished career as the editor and publisher of the San Jose Mercury and a few other Knight Ridder publications. But Harris was completely different. Harris understood completely the importance of pressure politics on institutions to affect change. And the first thing he did was he held a reception at his home. He was now the executive editor of the paper, and he held a reception at his home for the Third World Caucus. And first thing he did is, "I want to thank you all, because I know that I was qualified for this job, but until there was pressure from inside on the company, they would never have thought of hiring me. So I understand that I owe you all a debt, and I'm going to try to make this paper different in the way it covers the African American Latino community." Completely different response, same approach. Articulate your demands, pressure the institution, get some change. So sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, but you got to keep trying. Yeah.